Welcome to Helion Talks. I'm joined today by historian and author Michael Fredholm von Essen, whose work spans a vast array of topics from contemporary warfare to fascinating historical case studies. Today we'll be talking about his new book, Whiskey on the Rocks, and that's about a Cold War standoff between the Soviet Union and Sweden. Welcome, Michael, and could you please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for inviting me. A few words about myself then. After military service, which was compulsory at the time, I worked for the Ministry of Defense as a military analyst for many years. Then I got a position at Stockholm University in the Department of Central Asian Studies. In that capacity, I lectured and published a lot on the history of Eurasia. Also, I lectured a lot around the world to students and as a visiting professor and so on. Meanwhile, I also worked as an independent academic advisor to a number of governmental, intergovernmental, and non-governmental bodies for more than 2 decades. Some of them consisted of work for the Swedish Foreign Ministry in their official reports on Eastern Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and failing states, which was a big concern at the time and still is. Finally, I ended up doing work for the Swedish police. I, for instance, led the team which developed the lone actor terrorism counter strategy and training program for what was then the Swedish National Bureau of Investigation and now the Swedish Police Authority. Other tasks over the years included counterterrorism, for instance, at the National Center for Terrorist Threat Assessment, and also work against organized crime. In fact, some of these experiences, I have mentioned some of it in my recent Helion book on hybrid threats, concept and recognition guide. I am also an academic member of the editorial board of the history project of the Swedish Cygnus Intelligence Service, the National Defense Radio Establishment, or FRA as it is known in Sweden. In this role, I carried out extensive research and also wrote a number of books on the history of Swedish intelligence. And one of them also became a Helion book that was The Hunt for the Starashevoi, the 1975 Soviet Navy mutiny in the Baltic Sea.
Fascinating. And you mentioned those books, Michael. We'll be sure to add them, including your recent publication, Hybrid Threats, in the show notes. So to our listeners, please do look out for those books, and we'll be happy to welcome Michael back to talk a little bit in more detail about those in future. But for today, could you give us a bit of insight into this title, Whiskey on the Rocks? Because it certainly got me thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, so this was an incident during the Cold War. On the 27th of October 1981, a Soviet submarine of the Baltic Fleet ran aground on a rock on the south coast of Sweden. This was very close to naval base Karlskrona, one of the largest Swedish military bases. So it became a rather serious diplomatic and military crisis that continued for 10 days and in fact continued afterwards as well. The stranded submarine was a so-called Whiskey-class submarine. So already as it happened, as soon as international media got involved, the incident rapidly became known as Whiskey on the Rocks. And that seems to remain the popular name in the West for this incident. You may even have watched a recent TV series, which also was named Whiskey on the Rocks and which was loosely based on these events.
I did see that on Netflix, and although we're not, being sponsored by Netflix, we'll be happy to add that show into our show notes also. And it certainly is a catchy title. But Michael, with that in mind, what inspired you to write a little bit more about the history of this Swedish and Soviet standoff in your new book?
So as I mentioned, I carried out research for the history project of the National Defense Radio Establishment. And while doing that, I realized that something unusual had happened in the initial stages of the Whiskey on the Rocks crisis. Now, in this kind of situation, military intelligence is supposed to assess the facts, to ascertain what has happened before government then takes a formal position. However, in 1981, it turned out that the Swedish Supreme Commander, General Lennart Ljung, he bypassed his own military intelligence service when he rapidly concluded, in a real hurry, he had only 10 minutes and he didn't know a thing about submarines, Anyway, he concluded that the stranded Soviet whiskey submarine was on a spying mission. Now, in reality, the available evidence suggested that the submarine had struck the rock because of a navigation error. But since General Jung was the supreme commander, his was the view that kind of took hold of the government position. And since this kind of incorrect assessment isn't supposed to happen, it inspired me to investigate further based on recently declassified documents. And that's how it went. So then I wrote the book.
Fascinating. And I think in practice, just in life, we often have big, strong personalities, whether that's military commanders or politicians, having to make these decisions sometimes under pressure. And maybe that pressure is a little bit invented, right? Like it's not something that exists, or maybe they perceive it to exist, maybe something around that context of the Cold War.
Very true. We can't know exactly what General Jung was thinking at the time, because even though he had an official diary, he didn't actually explain very much about his decision. But he was in the middle of asking for a significantly higher military budget at the time. And of course, to have a Soviet spy submarine at hand, that would have helped.
It is a convenient occurrence. And while you wrote this, Michael, was there a particular character or aspect that surprised you during the process of your research?
Yeah, I would say that was the submarine itself. We know this because most of the documentation relating to the incident, it has been declassified both in Russia and in Sweden. In Sweden, the armed forces kindly released the documents last year when I requested them. Nobody had released them before. Now, from these documents, we can learn a number of things about the submarine. We can, for instance, learn the name of it, its designation, which was different from what was thought at the time. We also can learn it was an attack submarine of a class that the Soviet Union designated Project 613, but in the West, as I mentioned, it was known as a whiskey class. More importantly for this incident is that this was an old medium-sized diesel-electric submarine, as the Soviets called it. And it was very old. It was one or more than 200 vessels of its class built in the early 1950s. And when the incident took place, the submarine had already been in service for 24 years. In fact, some of the crew on board were not yet born when the submarine entered into service. And even more striking, the design was much older still, because the class known as Project 613, or Whiskey, it derived from the German Type 21 submarine, which was a design developed during the Second World War. So essentially, the Soviet submarine was a piece of obsolete World War II technology, which nonetheless had remained in active service. Now, we could also see that at the time, because eventually Swedish officers entered the submarine and could investigate it. And most of the navigation equipment and some electronics were old. Some of the original gear from 1956 remained in operation, and it was described as rusty, scratched, and in poor condition. This was, of course, non-news to the Soviet Navy. They knew this was an obsolete submarine, and they had a naval doctrine which made sure that older submarines such as this, they were employed for combat duties that were complementary to more modern vessels. So at the time, Soviet doctrine regarded US aircraft carrier groups as one of the more serious threats, because it could carry bombers which were armed with nuclear weapons and thus could reach deep into Soviet territory. So the Soviets devised a number of means to attack these carrier groups. But for the old submarines, such as the Whiskey class, they realized already in the 1960s that they were very limited in combat capabilities with regard to carrier groups. Yet they could be used in what the Soviets called closed sea theaters. One of them was the Baltic Sea. So there they could simply lie in wait or carry out barrier patrols and keep hidden. And if war broke out, then they could attack the carrier groups when they entered the Baltic Sea of course, they could attack them with nuclear torpedoes. And this role still suited the old submarines. So this is exactly what it was tasked to do. It was on a so-called barrier patrol mission in the outer zone of defense. And it carried 2 nuclear torpedoes for use against such high-value targets such as aircraft carriers. Now, however, then the submarine crew got lost and accidentally ended up in Swedish waters. And that was the beginning of the crisis.
It was fascinating, and that history of how the submarines developed just take us through that Cold War period. But if you could take our listeners to one place in the book, the Swedish military response perhaps, or diplomatic tensions, or maybe another area, what would that be, Michael?
I would say that after Swedish Supreme Commander General Jung already decided that this was a submarine on a spying mission, from that decision, much of the Swedish response came to deal with what they thought would be an armed Soviet incursion into Swedish water on a rescue mission. They thought if this is a spying submarine, then surely the Soviets will attack and just bring it back instead of abandoning it to us. So already on the first day of the incident at the so-called, at the so-named Västgöta Air Wing, F6, one of the Swedish air wings, Major Leif Åström, he was called to base to set up a strike group of 4 AG-37 Viggen fighters that would intervene against what was then believed or expected to be a full-scale Soviet armed relief attempt. But the problem was that the 2 countries were, of course, not at war. It was just so far an incident, so Major Åström was told to choose a weapons load that could either be used to fire warning shots or fire limited effect fire or full effect fire, depending on the situation. Now, he had to follow the peacetime regulations of course, at first to fire a warning shot and only later, if necessary, launch effective fire. So Åström had a task to select a mixed weapons load for his 4 aircraft. So his selection was a bit interesting. He selected for one of the aircraft for warning purposes. It was loaded with 16 high-explosive parachute bombs that could be dropped ahead of what they expected to be the intruding Soviet ships. Now, being dropped ahead of the ship, it wouldn't actually damage the intruder, but the detonations would be felt as a shockwave throughout the entire ship. Now, there was also to be a limited effect fire if that was necessary. That was one aircraft. And for that, he selected attack rockets in 4 rocket pods and also some illumination bombs. Now, attack rockets doesn't sound very up to date, and it wasn't. And after the mission, he wondered if this really would actually have impacted, had an effect on a warship. But then, of course, there was also the possibility that he needed actually to fight. So 2 of the 4 aircraft, they were loaded with RB-04E tactical naval air-to-ground missiles. These were known as ship killers in the Swedish Air Force, and they were to be used only if the Soviets either opened fire or for some reason did not heed the warning fire. So that was a complicated task to figure out what to carry. But then the weather was so poor during the incident, so now they had to wait until the next morning. So finally what they did was to plan the mission with a takeoff time at 6:40 a.m. Then the flight would take place in darkness, but when they approached the target, that would be exactly at dawn. And on that way, the Soviet ships would be visible as silhouettes against the first light of dawn, while the Swedish aircraft would also be easily spotted by their switched-on navigation lights. Because the Air Force realized that they didn't want to escalate this incident, this crisis, by surprising the Soviets. So they wanted the Soviets to see as they were approaching. Then when they finally reached the Soviet task force, then Åström carried out a flyby at a fairly moderate speed, again, for the Soviets to be able to detect the Viggen aircraft. However, he kept the aircraft with air-to-ground missiles well behind the others. That aircraft did not participate in the flyby because he wanted to keep it out of range of the Soviet ships' surface-to-air missiles if actual combat would take place later. Now, after all these preparations, Åström noted that this was actually not an intrusion, an ongoing intrusion. In fact, the Soviet ships were stationary right on the 12 nautical mile line that delimited the border. The Soviets did not have any fire control radar in operation, and there was actually no visible activity on board. So there was no hostile intent that was visible. This was, of course, quite contrary to what the Swedish command had expected. So this was a mission that in one way didn't result in anything, but it was very dramatic because when it started, nobody knew what was going to happen or even what they would expect.
And also fascinating in the control measures that were taken, the thought in not escalating. And I suppose that was very typical of the Cold War period, but, just given the stakes. But really interesting how that all played out. And finally, can you tell us a little bit about the sequel, Michael? What can readers expect, and where does the story go from there?
Yeah, so the Soviet Naval Task Force, which had arrived, and the one that the vegan pilots had observed, that was a task force under Vice Admiral Alexei Kalinin of the Baltic Fleet. Now, they had come to salvage the submarine. They hadn't come to carry out an armed rescue as the Swedes believed at the time. However, Kalinin was indeed prepared for the need that maybe he would have to rescue the submarine. Maybe armed forces might be required after all. So while he waited there at the maritime border, and the crisis continued and in fact escalated because of a number of faulty assumptions, not least by General Jung. So there wasn't a continuing confrontation, and that will be described in the sequel. To some extent, the continuing confrontation was more serious than the initial one, because as the Swedes kept the submarine on the rock and did not release it and did not salvage it, to Vice Admiral Kalinin, it began to seem as if the Swedes have taken the submarine hostage. So Soviet Special Forces, Spetsnaz, they deployed to launch a raid to rescue the submarine and its crew if necessary. And for a few critical hours, Swedish and Soviet air and naval assets, they prepared to engage in battle. And that was serious enough, but it was also fascinating to note that as this was a few days after the submarine had stranded, so already both national and international media had moved on scene, and there were now every hotel in Karlskrona was full of journalists, most of them foreign journalists. And even though they were there in full force with helicopters and everything to monitor the crisis, the media actually never noticed that both sides prepared for battle. So that will be part of the sequel, and it will also describe how the incident was concluded in the end, and I will go into the consequences for both Swedish and Soviet security in the Baltic region following on from this particular crisis. And finally, the sequel will include additional descriptions of the sources we have to understand the incident, and there will also be translations into English, that is, of all relevant post-incident reports. For instance, the Soviet Commission of Inquiry report, the 2 secret reports by the Swedish Supreme Commander, and also the Swedish Defense Staff's public report of the incident.
No, that's fascinating, Michael. And for me, I don't know much about the incident, excepting very high level, of course, before preparing for this podcast. And it does come out more and more like the Swedish version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, in a different way, just the standoff. And for the serious historians out there, I'm sure they'll be very, very interested in some of the translations of those Swedish sources and the contribution to the historiography.
You mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you can. That's actually a good comparison because, after all, this incident was and is still being described as the most serious crisis in the Baltic Sea with relating to Sweden during the Cold War, because at this time Swedish territory was directly involved. And it's a striking fact that Sweden mobilized in southern Sweden near the naval base and the area of operations. So war could easily have broken out if mistakes had been made.
And with that, we want to just, we'll add the links to the show notes for our listeners. Please do go and get this book from Michael, as well as the hybrid threats. We'll put them all in the show notes. A big thank you, Michael, and a big thank you to all our listeners.
Thank you.